Today I'd like to try to simplify FINTRAC for you if I can. First of all, what is FINTRAC? FINTRAC is an acronym that stands for Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada. What it is legislation that has been in effect since June 23rd, 2008. And what it means for realtors is that we must identify all clients and we must identify where all deposits are sent. Okay, this legislation was enacted to try to curb money laundering and terrorism, and for not complying, the fines are $2 million or 5 years in prison or both for a first offense. So it's important that we follow these regulations. I don't want to go to jail. You don't want to go to jail. Okay, first of all, we'll talk about sellers and what is required when you're dealing with sellers. The only form that you actually require when you're dealing with a seller is an individual identification record. This form is mandatory for every single seller that you're dealing with. If it's a corporation, the form that you use is a corporate identification information record. It is also required for FSBOs. Even though you're not representing them, you're required to gather information for the FINTRAC forms. If the FSBO or the client refuses to give the information, you write that across the form and hand in the form. The next one is when you're representing a buyer. When you're representing a buyer, you use the same form as you do for the sellers, which is the individual identification form. In addition to this, you also use a receipt of funds record. The receipt of funds record shows that you have received a deposit on behalf of your buyer. This form is always filled out by the buyer's realtor and is kept by the buyer's realtor's brokerage. Do not share this form with the other brokerage. It is important to remember that when you're doing the individual identification form or the receipt of funds for the buyer, that you also include buyers that are customers. It is your responsibility as a realtor to get this information on a customer as well as a client. The only exception to this particular receipt of funds is if the deposit is going directly into a builder's or developer's trust account. If that is the case, you do not require the receipt of funds. Transactional brokerage. When you're representing both the sellers and the buyers, of course, you require all the forms required for each individual seller and each individual buyer. And lastly, we want to talk about when you're not face-to-face with your client. If your client is in another country, another city, and you cannot represent them, you have to fill out what is called a mandatory form. This form is sent to another agent in another city, and they do the identification on your behalf. You cannot take identification over the phone. It must be done in person.